Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are looking at something pretty fascinating, and honestly, it's a little bit puzzling too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the gender gap in life expectancy.
Okay.
We've got to be looking at some research and some really cool maps and charts to see just how much longer women are living than men in different parts of the world.
Sounds interesting.
And we're going to try to figure out why this is happening. Why is there this persistent difference?
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated issue for sure.
Yeah.
But what is super interesting is that the gap is not the same everywhere, you know?
Right.
It's big in some places, and then in others it's much smaller.
Yeah.
And that's really what we want to look at today. Like, why are there such big differences in this gap in different places in the world?
In the data skies we take our flight. Trends and numbers come to life. Colors and charts, they dance and play, showing truths in a visual way. In GenderDecoded we uncover truths and stories like no other. In the data waves we find the secret maps of humankind.
First up, a world map that shows these gaps, like a heat map.
So the hotter the color, the bigger the difference in lifespans between men and women.
You got it. And we also have this chart that shows how life expectancy has changed globally since 1950, and it plots that against the size of the gender gap. Should be interesting.
It's really fascinating stuff. One of the things that surprised me is that the biggest gaps aren't always where you might think.
Right. You'd think maybe places with the lowest overall life expectancy, but that's not always the case.
Nope, not at all. The former Soviet Union really stands out. We're talking a 10 to 12-year difference in some cases.
Yeah, it's huge. It makes you wonder why. You'd think regions struggling with poverty or healthcare would have bigger gaps, but the data says something different. It really highlights how many factors are at play here. Socioeconomic development, for sure, but also things like cultural norms, healthcare systems, even historical events.
Okay, so let's look at this world map. Like we said, those former Soviet states are deep purple, meaning huge gaps. But then, as you move westward into Europe, things start to change.
Literally cool down. Western Europe usually has a smaller gap somewhere between 3 and 6 years.
Now, that doesn't mean they've got it all figured out, but it does make you think, right?
Absolutely. It suggests that maybe things like strong healthcare systems and even more gender-equal health behaviors could be playing a role.
Makes sense. But then Africa shows a totally different pattern.
Yeah, many African countries have moderate to lower gaps, even though overall life expectancy is lower there compared to many other regions.
So the factors impacting life expectancy there might be affecting both men and women pretty equally.
Possibly. It's complicated. But back to that former Soviet Union region for a second.
Yeah, that big purple zone on the map. Why is the gap so big there? It's like a giant flashing sign.
Well, you have to think about the history there. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to some major social and economic changes, which probably had an impact.
Makes sense.
Plus, our sources point to a few other things, like high rates of alcohol consumption among men, a lot of men working in dangerous jobs, and maybe even differences in how men and women approach healthcare.
Interesting. So you're saying men in these post-Soviet countries might be less likely to go to the doctor? Is that like a cultural thing?
Could be. There might be a cultural stigma around men showing vulnerability or asking for help, or maybe it ties into a sense of stoicism that was, kind of a big deal in Soviet time.
It really makes you think, if those social norms were different, would the gap be smaller? Like, what if we totally flipped the script on traditional ideas about masculinity? Would that change things? So much to consider.
It definitely raises some interesting questions. But let's switch gears for a minute and look at our second visualization, that chart, showing how life expectancy has improved since 1950.
All right, bring it on. What are we looking at here?
You'll see right away that some countries have made absolutely incredible gains. Cambodia and Rwanda, for example, have seen life expectancy go up by about 60 years each.
Whoa, 60 years. That's unbelievable. What could cause that kind of jump?
Probably a bunch of factors, but major development efforts and public health initiatives have definitely played a role.
Especially in post-conflict recovery, right? They've literally given people decades more life.
It's amazing. But then we see places like Germany. Their gains are smaller, maybe 10 to 20 years. Still significant, but smaller.
So does that mean their progress is less impressive?
Not at all. Remember, they were starting from a higher point back in 1950. It's kind of like diminishing returns,
Yeah.
When you're already doing well, making huge improvements is tougher.
I see. So even a 10-year increase in Germany is a big deal because they were already pretty healthy. But this is where it gets really interesting to me. Those former Soviet countries, even though they've made progress, still have that huge gender gap we talked about.
It's like they're moving forward, but dragging this weight along with them. It suggests that while overall health may be getting better, the root causes of the gender difference haven't been addressed.
Interesting. So am I seeing a pattern here? Is the country's development linked to the size of its gender gap? Like, as things improve, does the gap shrink?
It's tempting to say yes, but it's more complicated than that. What we tend to see is that big jumps in life expectancy are often accompanied by a narrowing of the gap. But not always.
So maybe it's more like, as things improve, there's a potential for the gap to shrink, but other stuff can get in the way.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really interesting. We need to look at specific examples to really understand this.
All right, let's do it. In part 2, we'll compare and contrast a few countries to see how this all plays out in the real world. Don't go anywhere, folks.
Welcome back, everyone. So before we jump into those country comparisons, let's talk a bit more about what can actually create such a wide gap in life expectancy between men and women. We've seen it's not always just about, economic development or access to healthcare.
Yeah, those cultural and societal factors you mentioned earlier. What are we talking about there? Like, what kind of things can really impact how long men and women live?
Well, one thing that pops up a lot in research is risky behavior. Stuff like smoking, drinking too much, even things like dangerous driving or violence.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, these things tend to be more common among men in a lot of cultures.
Yeah, it's almost like a cliche, right? The whole live fast, die young thing you see in movies. But it sounds like those cliches might have some truth to them.
They really might.
Yeah.
And the consequences can be serious. These behaviors can lead to accidents, health problems, even early death, which all contribute to that life expectancy gap.
Okay, so we've got risky behavior. What else is there? It feels like we're just scratching the surface.
Oh, we are. Another thing to think about is the kind of work men often do. In many parts of the world, men are more likely to have physically demanding or dangerous jobs. Think construction, mining, agriculture.
Right, jobs that involve more risks, tougher conditions, maybe exposure to, harmful substances. You don't see a lot of women working on oil rigs or in coal mines.
Exactly. And those risks can really add up over time. They take a toll on men's health and can contribute to a shorter lifespan.
So we've got the live fast part with the risky behaviors, and now the work hard angle with the dangerous jobs. It's like a recipe for a shorter life, unfortunately.
It is a bit grim, but important to talk about. But there's another piece here that we can't ignore. Access to healthcare. You might think everyone would just, go to the doctor when they need to, but it's not always that simple.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting to me. You're saying just getting healthcare can be a factor in the gender gap.
Absolutely. In some cultures, there's a stigma around men expressing vulnerability or asking for help when they're not feeling well. It's almost like they're supposed to just tough it out, even when they really should see a doctor.
So are you saying men in these cultures might ignore health problems or wait too long to get treatment because they don't want to seem weak?
That's one way to look at it, yeah. Is all these cultural expectations and social pressures. Think about that classic image of this strong, silent type. That kind of ideal can make it hard for men to talk about their health or get the care they need.
So it's almost a double whammy. Men are more likely to engage in risky behaviors and then less likely to get help when those behaviors, catch up with them.
It's a tough cycle to break. And it really highlights the need to look at these underlying cultural issues if we want to close the gap. It's not just about telling men to, man up and take care of themselves. It's about creating a culture where it's okay for them to be proactive about their health, physical and mental.
I see what you mean. So we've talked about behavior, work, and healthcare access. What else are we missing? I feel like there's got to be more.
There's always more. One area we can't ignore is stress and mental health. Now, these are hard to measure directly, but we know that chronic stress can really impact our well-being. And it's likely men and women experience stress differently in many societies.
That's so true. We talk a lot about the pressures on women, but men definitely have their own set of expectations and burdens.
Absolutely. Traditional gender roles, pressure at work, the expectation to be the provider, the protector, all of that can contribute to stress and impact men's health.
And it's not just about feeling stressed, right? There are real physical consequences.
Exactly. Chronic stress is linked to heart disease, stroke, digestive problems, even a weakened immune system. It's all connected. This really underscores the need to think about men's health in a more holistic way. You have to acknowledge the physical, the mental, and the social factors.
So if we want to close this gap, we need more than just, public health initiatives. We need to look at the underlying social and cultural stuff that contributes to it.
You got it. It takes a multi-pronged approach. Policymakers, healthcare providers, communities, individuals, everyone needs to work together to make things more equitable and healthier.
Okay, so we've laid out the challenges, but what about solutions? Are there places out there successfully tackling this issue? I'm really curious to see how different countries are approaching it.
That's a great question, and the good news is there are. In Part 3, we'll look at some real-world examples of countries trying to close that gap. We'll see what strategies they're using, what's working, what's not, and what we can all learn from them.
Sounds fascinating. I'm ready to be inspired. Let's do it.
We're back and ready to tackle the big question, what can we actually do to close this gender gap in life expectancy? We've seen the data, explored the factors. Now let's talk solutions.
Time for action. And luckily, we're not starting from scratch. There are countries making real progress, and we can learn a lot from them. Okay, I'm ready for some inspiration. Give me a success story. Who's doing this well?
One great example is Sweden. They've really managed to shrink the difference in life expectancy between men and women. Over the past few decades, they've made huge strides.
Sweden. Makes sense. They're known for their, strong social safety net, right?
Exactly. Their robust welfare state is a key factor. Universal health care, generous parental leave, strong social safety nets. It all adds up to create a more equitable environment for everybody.
So it's not just about healthcare, it's about making sure everyone has access to the resources they need. Interesting.
It's a big picture approach, and it's working. Sweden consistently ranks among the countries with the smallest gender gaps in life expectancy.
Pretty impressive. Sweden's definitely onto something. But what about those risky behaviors we talked about? Is anyone tackling those directly?
Russia's actually been trying to curb excessive alcohol consumption, which, as we know, is a big factor in their large gender gap.
Wow, Russia. That's a big challenge. Alcohol's such a part of their culture. What are they doing?
A few things. Higher taxes on alcohol, restrictions on when it can be sold, and public awareness campaigns about the dangers of drinking too much.
So a multi-pronged approach, hitting it from all sides. Have they seen any results?
It's still kind of early, but some studies show these measures might be helping. There's been a slight decrease in alcohol consumption, especially among younger men.
That's good. Even a little decrease is a step in the right direction. It shows they're making progress. Now, how about workplace safety? Are there countries working to make dangerous jobs less dangerous?
Absolutely. Canada has some of the strongest workplace safety regulations out there. They really prioritize worker protection.
And that's good for everybody, not just men.
Exactly. It helps prevent injuries and exposure to dangerous stuff, no matter who you are.
So a win-win, a safer workplace, means a healthier workforce overall. But what about those deeper cultural norms that we talked about? The stigma around men seeking help, those traditional ideas about what it means to be a man. Any countries trying to change that?
That's where it gets trickier. But some countries are making progress. Scotland, for instance, has launched campaigns encouraging men to talk about their mental health and get help if they need it.
It's like they're saying, hey, it's okay to not be okay. Let's support each other.
Exactly. It's about shifting the culture so that being vulnerable is seen as a strength, not a weakness.
So it seems like the most effective strategies involve both policy changes and cultural shifts, right? No easy answers, but a lot of promising approaches.
You're right, it's complex. We have to address the structural things that create inequality and the social norms that keep them going.
Ultimately, it's about making sure everyone, no matter their gender, has the chance to live a long, healthy life. That's the goal, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's about equity, fairness, and realizing that everyone benefits when we invest in each other's well-being.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've seen the global picture, the factors involved, and some potential solutions from different parts of the world.
And we've seen that this is about more than just numbers. It reflects how societies value and support different groups. It's a call to action for all of us.
So as we wrap up, we'd like to leave you with a final thought. We've talked a lot about big picture strategies, but what about your role? What can you do? Think about your community. How can you promote healthier behaviors, challenge harmful norms, and support policies that make the world a more equitable place?
These are important questions, and we hope you keep exploring them. The answers might surprise you.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.